today. Jonathan Rosenthal, who is the Executive Director of New Economy Coalition. He's been in this position for approximately 2 years.
1 year.
1 year? Yeah.
364 days, I think. But who's counting?
Tomorrow will be the first anniversary. Jonathan is a veteran of the fair trade movement. He's been active in this movement for 35 years before joining NEC, and he also started his own fair trade enterprises. So we are really delighted to have him here. No slides, no written talk. This will be a conversation. This couple of things, and I see Bob Massey here, who's very welcome. It's good to see you, who was Jonathan's predecessor and a founder. Would I say founder?
No, I grew out of Schumacher.
But you were at the ground level of the...
I was there when they transitioned from the Youth Economics Institute
to New Economy College.
The whole story itself.
And we have both TELUS and SCORI are co-sponsoring this seminar. SCORI, as I think everybody knows at this point here, is Sustainable Consumption Research and Action Initiative, which is a knowledge network of around 800 scholars and practitioners around the world. And TELUS, I don't think I need to introduce TELUS and its Great Transition Initiative that we are all familiar with. TELUS and SCORI have been collaborating very closely for several years to the great benefits of both organizations. So I'm happy to host another interesting meeting through this partnership. So I asked Jonathan to speak for approximately half an hour, at which point we will open it for a discussion, questions, answers. I will moderate it as best I can. This is a lively, great, bushy-tailed group made forward to the discussion and the presentation. And just so that you know, we videotape these talks, then we edit them, and if the speaker agrees with the final product, and if it all looks good, we post it on SCORI website.
Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with all of you today for this presentation and conversation about new economy in the 21st century. Where have we been? Where are we heading? How might we get there? I like to start off when I give a talk just to have a moment of silence to recognize, for me, the ancestors and people that have given me inspiration, that have come before me in the many movements over the last 5,000 years that have gotten us, for better and for worse, to this point in history. And for me in particular, I like to remember my great-great-grandfather, Marcus Whitmark, who came to this country as an itinerant peddler and within 10 years was financing his own regiment as a slaveholder in the Confederate Army. One of 3,000 Jews who fought on the Confederate side. So that always kind of gives me a grounding in my own social activism of where I've come from and how grateful I am, not always for the bright sides of history, but all sides of history. So just a moment for us to locate ourselves in history, however we might do that. Thank you. So I'd like to start off, people are eating, but I also like to have all of us kind of locate ourselves physically here now. So I'd like to ask a little experiment. It won't be too challenging, but it will probably bring a little energy into the room. If there's not too much difficulty while you're eating, to just turn to somebody next to you. And it's a very simple exercise. You grasp the person next to you, one forearm. You each grab each other's forearm if you're comfortable with touch. You could shake hands, or you can just... The real point of the exercise is to look into the person next to you's eyes, to just look directly into their eyes and see what the experience is like for you, what comes up. For you, you can do it for 1 second, you can do it for 20 seconds. All right, thank you very much. So if you can bring your attention back to the room, as you can see, it does liberate a certain amount of energy, usually a certain amount of laughter, discomfort, and I think for me, social change starts with each of us in our own physical body, which for some is a comfortable and for some a less comfortable experience. And it also is about how do we connect with one another. And I think in many cultures, and particularly in our own, although we have a very centralized and sexualized culture in many ways, we're also kind of uncomfortable with physical connection with each other, particularly if it's not an intimate partner. And yet, I think we can all recognize the energy that's generated immediately of just connecting in that way, of looking into somebody's eyes without particular intent, but just to connect to their spirit, their soul, their heart, whatever language works for you. And I think for me, social change and building new economy requires each of us to occasionally step out of our comfort zone and also to recognize the connectedness and interconnectedness we have, hopefully with ourselves, with each other. And when I was in my 20s, I had the good fortune to visit the Sarvodaya Shramadana movement in Sri Lanka, developing a tea program with them, which didn't last very long, but learning about this kind of simple Buddhist concept of social support. So we come to another one of our tensions that we're playing with. We were started as a think tank with a self-selected board of mostly older, wealthy white people. We took this pretty radical pivot to become a coalition. Maybe to some people that meant more of a network than a coalition. What's the difference? Topic for another day. And so, how do we balance this vanguard approach that we started with a top-down self-selecting group and this pivot we've made to be a membership organization, have our board more and more elected by members to be accountable to membership? And so at the moment, we're kind of in the midst of that transition still. About a third of our board is member elected. We still are largely accountable to our board, to our membership in a theoretical way, but not in a practical way. And so we're in this kind of what I call a cat-dog phase. We're part cat, we're part dog. We're bottom up, we're top down, and so we're trying to use that as another creative tension, dialectical tension, depending on your come from place, to help us maximize our innovation and flexibility and also build collective will, collective voice, and collective power through this coalition/network that we're building. So as I said, when I came in, the strategies to do that weren't clear. We kind of went from one event, let's do a conference, we'll see what happens, which I think was the exact right way to get going, but also makes it difficult for people to understand what you're doing. It makes it difficult for staff to know when they're successful and when they're not. And it sure does make it difficult to raise money if your outcomes aren't that clear and your processes change all the time. So again, we're kind of holding on to that innovation and deep experimentation, and also getting a bit clear, at least on an operational level, about where do we think we can make the most difference. So far for us, we do our work in really 3, maybe 4 ways coming up. The most evident way is that we do convening and connecting work, and we do that formally and informally. So the formal, we put on every 2 years roughly, national or binational with Canada conference. We have one coming up in July in Buffalo called Common Bound. We'll have somewhere 700, 800,000 people there from all walks of life. We have added a small global element this year. We have a small research lab with people coming from about 4 or 5 different countries. And it's mostly an idea for people to share ideas, meet each other, build relationships, build trust, learn from one another, and weave together a piece of the fabric of this thing called New Economy. This year we shifted the format quite a bit for how Common Bound gets planned. So we borrowed a lot of the practices of a group called the Allied Media Coalition that puts on the Allied Media Conference in Detroit every year. In January, we put out a call for people to propose small groups that would organize workshop tracks. So we had about 30 proposals. We accepted half of them. We had a one-day meeting with 1 or 2 people from each group, put that together. They helped plan the trajectory of the conference. Then we put out a call for workshop proposals. A few folks in this room are part of that piece. We got about close to 300 proposals for workshops. The volunteer groups in each track, sorting through them, come back with the kind of merging some, a few that don't quite make sense, we had to say no to, come up with this very collaboratively developed, produced, and run conference. The day before the conference, we made a space for network gatherings, again building that connectivity. So we'll have about 20 different groups that will use that day of people being in the same place to convene a gathering for Black Lives Matter, for worker co-ops, whole range of sectors. So the other part of convening and connecting we do on the informal side is really just matchmaking. So if there's a group in St. Louis doing affordable housing work through housing co-ops, we connect them with a group doing that in Buffalo that's already purchased many buildings and is further down the road. So that kind of work of just connecting people so everyone's not reinventing the wheel, and again, building trust and connectivity. The next kind of leg of our stool is building narrative frameworks and media competency. So we're in the early stages of something called a meta-narrative project, where we're working with a group called the Center for Story-Based Strategy that does narrative work for movements. And we're not developing the narrative of New Economy. Rather, we're helping develop basic frameworks about how do you tell the story, develop some common language, some common approaches, and then do training so that people are better able to tell their stories. And we will develop a way to collect those into kind of the collective voice, collective narratives, and bring them to essentially a more mainstream audience. And all of that happens through a media platform that has a social media side and a traditional media side of building relationships with, currently it's been mostly left periodicals, so Mother Jones, Dissent, Democracy Now!, The Nation, The Guardian. But increasingly we'll be working to do that in a more mainstream way. And starting to work with some folks internationally, and there's this idea of that people have been working on for years, taking lessons from neoliberals, the Powell memo, their rather disciplined approach. We look to have a much more chaotic, disciplined approach, realistically, than they did, but have a way to essentially have a wake for neoliberalism, help it continue its decline, and create ways for new economy to have more of a global presence, and really put out there that there are other ways that are possible, other worlds that are possible, and that we know how to build those worlds to some extent already. So the third piece, which is a smaller piece, not to say it's not important, right now we have a regranting program, and the main idea of that program is to provide access for youth and student groups, frontline communities who are traditionally marginalized from access to money, resources, sometimes relationships, knowledge, and ultimately power, and developing their power. And so currently we do small grants to give people access to conferences, to trainings, to be able to get access to knowledge and relationships so they can build more powerful organizations, and again, build those relationships that help us weave together common cloth. We're also beginning work with funders, there are some in the new economy space, not many, but we're beginning to talk with them and help organize them to help them better understand what's possible. In some cases, to help them learn from other grassroots movements of different approaches to funding, and with an ultimate goal of really questioning how do resources, particularly in the nonprofit world, get distributed. Who has the decision-making power? Who's even at the table ever to make those decisions? A little bit tricky, as we ourselves are a grantee, and so we're also looking for funding from some of the same people that we're herding, organizing, pushing, and shaping. It's in early stages, but some really interesting, I would say, conversations so far. So the last, those are really our three kind of conventional pieces of our strategy. The new part for us is working on working groups. And we believe from doing member surveying and just our seeing what's happening out there, that one of the greatest opportunities for us, given our vantage point of seeing kind of the whole network of networks, the whole system, is to support and help shape working groups. And some of those will be issue-based, issue or sector-based, some will be geographically based, some will be skill-based. So we could have a communications working group, we could have a Black Lives Matter working group, we could have a Boston working group. Very different slices. There will be communities of practice, communities of thought, some very practical, just skill-based access to training. And so for us, the work is to experiment to see how much do we lead, how much do we follow, support in skill building, in resource acquisition, in trust building, in basic leadership and facilitation of these working groups. But ultimately, we see the opportunity in working groups that pretty quickly people can get to seeing where they can accomplish more together than they can individually. And I think for us, it's that promise that has brought people to the table as New Economy Coalition has kind of wandered around, sometimes in the dark, sometimes in the dusk, looking to see how much do we lead, how much do we follow and support, where can we have the most leverage to really weave together this cloth, or really this series of cloths. And so we do all of that again, trying to hold that tension between process and action, process and action. And I think at a staff level, we have some people that come from a more process-based background, a few folks that kind of grew up in activism in the Occupy movement, and we have folks from whose own family members are often struggling for basic survival, and so they have that deep imperative in themselves on a personal level to make sure we stay focused on action. So that's kind of our the different levels we work at in New Economy Coalition. I think for the future, we see for the first time really in my lifetime that the level of dissatisfaction with what we call the current system, whether you call that capitalism, the US democratic or neoliberal economy, society, however we define it, all surveys suggest, and personal experience of everybody, there's deep levels of satisfaction and interest in a way my elders say they haven't seen in their lifetime in new systems. And what are those new systems? It's not something in the United States that we have much familiarity with in a mainstream sense. It's mostly relegated to academia, think tanks, etc. And so kind of one of the last tensions for us is how do we build a bridge between those more and more real new ideas, whether it's from the TELUS Institute, Next Systems Project, Demos, individuals. There are many sources of those kind of inspiring visions. How do we hold those visions and create the bridges to make them accessible to more than the kind of fringe academia or the small left in the United States? So you can see a lot of our work is when do we take action directly ourselves, when do we build bridges, when do we support? So I think finally, before we get into conversation, I think one of the biggest challenges that we don't have a very good handle on so far is it's pretty easy to focus on all the amazing things happening in the small is beautiful new economy space, as well as on the resistance side of things. But building bridges between the current economy and these new visions, whether they're utopic, realistic, or otherwise, is a part that's really underdeveloped, right? And so in most of the new economy space, for example, relationships with organized labor are usually non-existent, thin, troubled, or it's just a few people. Everybody knows Joe Uline, but he's one person in organized labor. So I think a key challenge for us is how do we go from what I call the Walmart problem, how do we go from the Walmarts of the world, or even slightly more enlightened Unilevers of the world, having our economy really organized in that multinational way, to a new economy framework, which is perhaps more decentralized, more federated, looks pretty different. We're mostly focused in the new economy world in building these beautiful new things, but the connection between where we are right now and the beautiful new is, I think, the weakest part of our movement. And I think for New Economy Coalition in particular, we do not really have a strategy on how to deal with that yet. I think we're much more comfortable figuring out how do you weave together more power in this small is beautiful space without really figuring out that very important bridge from where we are. So I think that's my half an hour-ish limit. I'd love to get into some conversation and hear what kind of questions folks have, where you want to take the conversation.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yes.
So I'd like to depart from our usual script for discussion where we start with smaller, specific, clarifying questions and then move to the bigger questions. I'd like to start with bigger questions. And welcome. Who would like to start?
Okay, so I really appreciated the portion of your dialogue on the challenges that that New Economy Coalition has faced in trying to understand and envision itself as an exemplar in organizing for social change. So if this was the 19th century or even the 20th century, group of like-minded people would have come together and created a society or an association, drafted a set of bylaws, created a newsletter, a journal, had annual meetings and so forth. I think we probably both can quite quickly agree that that model is from a bygone era. And it's the same challenge that SCORI, the Sustainable Consumption Research and Action Initiative, has had in trying to conceptualize and understand how we organize and overcome problems of collective action in the 21st century. And I know TELUS Institute has also been trying to grapple with some of those same challenges. And so, I mean, we can probably talk about that at some time, a little bit later on. But but the question I have is that the historical arc of the New Economy Coalition, and some may disagree, was anchored, at least initially, in what we might think of as the sort of environmental movement, or the sort of movement of environmental activism. Connections, and particularly that was the case with the New Economy Foundation in the UK, the Schumacher Institute. And in your comments, you didn't give any real attention to environment as it's conceptually construed and understood for purposes of social activism and public policy formation. I'd be interested to get a little bit of feedback from you as to how you see that set of relationships between social activism and environmental activism, and how the fact that we live in a world of biophysical constraints informs your understanding of the mission of the coalition.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you my personal guide to that first, then I'll trim back up into NEC. So I think for me, I decided to leave it out of that first part because I was getting too cosmic. I didn't want to lose my audience. But for me, one of my guides is that I believe that in our society, and I mean that on a global level, we have allowed ourselves to put this idea of money at the center of our universe. And I believe that we are facing, in the worst case scenario, extinction of our species by allowing ourselves to put this commodity fetishism, whatever we want to call it, money is a convenient symbol at the center of reality, and we have this idea that all our sense of worth and meaning in the world somehow flows through money. So I think one of the fundamental requirements of new economy work is to put what I call Mother Earth and to recognize we all are interconnected with our mother, and that if we continue to ignore that, we will destroy our species, and we have come close on numerous occasions through nuclear weapons in particular doing that. And I think all traditional religions have some sense of the possibility of us destroying ourselves and that kind of dark side that we have inside of us as part of it. So I think at the same time, much of the environmental movement, I guess some aspects of it would also recognize that our definition of what is business and money, which are sometimes now used almost interchangeably, is part of the problem. I don't think that there's been a coherent social analysis that's deeply embedded in the environmental analysis. And so to me, that's made the cart of social change, if you will, off balance. And so I think one of our jobs in new economy work is to find new ways to integrate, again, history and social movements with environmental work. So whether that's a green, blue, red connection, I think that we all need to learn from each other. And so I think, like for us at New Economy Coalition, we have some strong environmental players in our network. We are really weak on the identity-based movement. So I can say, Black Lives Matter in particular, Dream Defenders, United We Dream, are the most vibrant social movements I feel like I've seen in my lifetime. And they are not really part of our space. And I think they have a fundamental problem that they are really part of a tradition of resistance to injustice, and have limited capacity to really be part of building something new. And I think that's hopefully what our movement can offer, is that we're weaving together different movements that include that resistance work, and the dreaming and visioning of the future, and also building bridges. So I think New Economy is not a movement really, but we're trying to weave together different movements. So that would include environmental movement, that would include these different strands of social justice. There's reproductive rights, gender-based liberation, other identity-based lenses that people are bringing. I think our job is to weave them together and to help people see that we need all of us. That the only hope, I believe, for systems change is by weaving together these movements. It doesn't mean we're all going to become one. I don't believe that's going to happen. I do believe, though, that we need to figure out where do we have common cause. How do we build collaboration while maintaining our unique identities? And I think it's not just New Economy Coalition that's going to do that, but I think it's recognizing the need to build those cross-movement collaborations and connections. To me, that's the secret for success. And when I look back on fair trade movement, feminist movement, civil rights movement, I think some of the limitations of all those movements were the limited ability to build cross-movement collaboration. There certainly was and is some. I don't want to go so far as to say it doesn't exist, but I think it's fairly limited. And we're so focused in our own point of view as being the way to create change. So I think, again, on a personal level, I sometimes have said I wish everybody could have a near-death experience and really understand that we're all connected. But it's not really a very practical way to go about social change, I can say from personal experience. But I do think, on a serious note, that it is about building cross-movement understanding that 1 + 1 = 3, that it is by working together on very specific common agendas where we have overlap, that's the secret to building enough power to create structural change. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
So the precondition, I would think, for building a systemic movement is having a systemic crisis, which I think people on this movement probably confirm is in process.
yes.
The question is, what is the nature of the systemic crisis? And why is it that people who are responding to different expressions of that crisis, whether it's from the justice side, the environmental side, or the governance side and so on, why do they need each other? And they need each other because if all of these different issues are expressions of a systemic problem, it can only be solved if they see the necessity of aligning and seeing their own issues as manifestations of a deeper issue. So the question is, what is that deeper systemic crisis, and what is the deeper systemic solution? And here I was very pleased that you prefaced your remarks by urging us to consider history and try to understand where we are in the context of the arc of history. So one thing in this building that we've come to a conviction about is that we're in the midst of a great historical shift, what we call the planetary phase of civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Namely, it's a crisis of modernity, that the interdependence and interlinkages across issues and people at the scale of the planet are so significant that the previous quasi-stability of modernity is falling apart. And so the great transition, as we call it, is trying to shape the nature of that system. Now, from that historical perspective, one sees an irreducibility to the global scale. And so again, another thing I appreciated, you're struggling with the handshake between the local and the global. But I think it's important to realize as you're trying to put together, a plural yet unified movement, that the global scale in itself is extremely important to consider. We did an experiment here a few years ago called the Widening Circle, where we brought together about 25 groups who take a global perspective, and themselves are kind of fractured and fragmented, and yet there was an ability, at least in principle, to come together around a common vision and agenda. So I would just suggest that there were two things that confused me about NEC. Is that what you call yourself?
Sure, NEC.
One is, why is it the economy? It sounds like what you're really interested in is a new civilization and all the different features that implies. And the second thing is, when you're talking about working groups in different regions, let's also remember that they're also multi-scales, and they're embedded in one another. And that global scale, and not as a contradiction between top-down and bottom-up, but a necessary, let's use your word, dialectic between the different spatial scales, is going to be absolutely essential to building a movement in the 21st century. And so I worry a little bit about the activist sensibility that tends to shift very heavily towards the bottom-up, local, horizontalism, and so forth. And I think we have to start defending the idea, and triumphantly defending the idea, that one can think in terms of embedded systems and embedded scales without it being an oppressive vision of what a future world might look like. So.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see. I'll say something briefly, and I think just keep opening it up. I mean, in terms of the name, I could defer to Bob, but I'll say I think my understanding from staff is that name was chosen. Really, people thought it was the best code word to talk about what previously might have been called socialism or new society, but that was not something that would have efficacy in building a network or a coalition. And new economy, I think they made the transition from economics to try and gently move away from just economics to economy being more than algorithms and equations. So I think in terms of the need for the global peace, I certainly recognize that the organization I stepped into that wasn't really part of the, I would say, awareness or strategic thinking so far. I think Bob certainly understands that, who was part of building that original direction, but the international global peace was not that strong by the time I came along. For me, it's critically important, and I think, part of how I understand it is that American exceptionalism is part of what we're working to take the best of in terms of innovation and energy and risk-taking, and also unlearn and heal the really destructive side of American exceptionalism, which says we are the greatest society ever, we're better than everybody else. And as somebody of Jewish heritage, I understand that notion of chosenness at a deep level. And that's part of why I like to invoke my great-great-grandfather also, because to me it kind of humbles sense of chosenness. So I think that is, again, part of our work is to unpack that. And so for me, practically, that is with staff of confronting people, hopefully in a gentle, healing way, about why they are so U.S.-centric. And I think part of it is just particular people, and part of it is the society we live in as well. And so I think that's part of our journey, is to build that connectivity at a global level and to see whatever we come up with as a subset of what's happening globally. And in a practical level, there are other countries, due to their cultural, political, just historic reasons, that have we have a lot to learn from. And so for us, it really slows us down to think we have to invent everything here. So I know my experiences in the UK, in the Basque region, in Cuba, in Ecuador, in Nicaragua, Mexico. There are incredible experiments happening there that are, that kind of blow us away. And likewise, there are things happening here that aren't happening anywhere else. So I think I completely agree with you. We need to see ourselves as just part of something that's bigger than ourselves. In terms of the top-down and democratic thing, I mean, I foremost identify as an entrepreneur, an innovator, and so I myself always struggle with the slowness and the conservative nature of cooperatives and often of deep grassroots collaboration. I also haven't seen anything better. And so when people, like staff, wanted us to go towards a 100% member elected board, and I said, we're not ready to do that yet. We're not clear enough on what we're trying to accomplish. So I like that cat dog. It's messier. I like it. So as one person, I push back pretty strongly on that piece, because I'd say we're not ready to make a decision either one way or the other. So for now, I'm content to just keep it in the middle with having some top-down, strengthening the bottom-up. And ultimately, in the short run, our biggest challenge is to create clear value for our members. So we have people that have joined, we offer little and ask less of our members, and that's not a recipe for long-term impact, right? So I think our challenge is that iterative process of developing more value and perceived value and asking more of our members, and that's a dance. Sometimes one comes before the other, and sometimes it has to flip. So I'm not sure if I'm answering questions, but
John, may I just a quick.
yeah.
First of all, I apologize. I have another appointment at 1:30, so I'm going to have to leave. But just a little historical context. So New Economics Institute was the brainchild and part of Susan Witt at the Schumacher Center and Stuart Wallace of NEF. So the original idea or the diagnosis was NEF and other groups like it in Europe and around the world have these wonderful cutting-edge ideas that were having a lot of trouble getting grounded and connected in the U.S. So that there needed to be a mechanism for the import of NEF-like ideas into U.S. setting and also potentially generate funding. So there was a kind of global intuition at the beginning. The transition to the coalition, I just want to mention this. First of all, we tested the Institute idea, let's do papers and so forth. There was just no takers, and part of the problem was there are thousands of papers being written. What was needed was some mechanism for exactly as you laid it out. I think just to comment on the name, New Economy, and it's interesting to hear your thoughts now. What we were running into is that people were attaching their energies and their loyalty to subcategories, things like green economy, circular economy, generative economy, solidarity economy. We actually came up with 32 synonyms. And the problem is that as each person built out their analysis within those categories, they became more attached to them, and in some sense more resistant. And so there was some very real, unless you accept my terms and analysis, for example, for the solidarity economy, I can't really work with you. And that's the opposite. Sort of find common ground, discover what areas we can, and have some mutual understanding that there are variations of emphasis and variations of analysis, but the larger category was one of deep dissatisfaction, desire for structural change.
Yeah.
So I think that persists in a problem, but the need to have a community or convening mechanism that allows for those variations of focus and scale and terminology, I think remains very high, and that's, I think, the steps that your kind of coalition is taking now around common bound and beyond are really, really needed.
Thank you. That was excellent historical clarity. Appreciate it. Thanks for being here, Bob.
And then Jonathan.
Thank you for your comments. I've noticed that when we talk about coalition, we tend to end up talking about a coalition in civil society, the plural sector. And I think that there's a lot of value in trying to develop a coalition that has some parity of power to actually challenge the dominant institutional group around economics and potentially destabilize them and restabilize them in a way that we think is more beneficial. But I'm interested in your thoughts about building coalitions with the other sectors. Public sector obviously is a huge part of the economy. I think in the U.S., depending on how you do the math, we're talking 20 to 30% of the economy. And of course, the private sector. And based on your work with fair trade and other kinds of private governance, multi-sector collaborations around sustainability and social initiatives, I think that there's potentially some opportunity there. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And also, there seems to be a lot of innovation in business models, in organizational forms, things like B Corps and cooperatives, different kinds of value propositions. And there's a way to build coalitions, with economic entities, organizations, businesses that can help provide some examples of small is beautiful within sort of the business community, to try and give some examples of how to try and move this forward a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think clearly public sector and policy is critical to creating any structural change. And we're really weak as a New Economy Coalition on that. I mean, there are parts of, you could say, oh, well, National People's Action does a lot of policy work, although it's not public sector. So we have some members that do that work, but it's not that active a part of our coalition right now. So I'd say it's just a really weak part, and it's something that we need to really figure out how to address. I think some of our help is going to come from our global connections, and I think getting some help from New Economics Foundation in the UK, in particular, who we have language ease with. They have a lot of experience in policy work in particular, and some public sector organizing, but I think that's a really difficult part for us to address. The easy path, and so the water of our organization is just sort of followed the paths of least resistance, are really around community organizing. And so that is student divest, reinvest, that is worker co-ops. B Corps is in there, although it's not a particularly active part of what we do. And so I think that's part of our work in this next period I think working groups can be one of the tools to do that. So for example, if we start an ownership working group, that will provide a very grounded place to not just have it be about worker co-ops, but now even the democratic worker co-op movement is kind of engulfed ESOPs as a necessary strategy. We can't just do co-ops, which is brilliant. But I mean, I'm really excited about that because I like to say I love democratic worker co-ops. How many jobs are there in the whole country? Under 10,000. There's a little bit of a problem. How do we get from 10,000 to, I don't know how many jobs we need in the US, 100 million, 150 million? It's a lot compared to 10,000. So I think it's that strategy of how do we build our circle out more rapidly. So I think ownership then will be a way to look at going from co-ops to ESOPs and including B Corp as part of that. And so I think we'll be looking for other opportunities to do that. How can we take what we have right now, grow the circle to incorporate that? I'm not sure that's going to get to public sector work, and so I think there are some of our members that are more in that. Some of the regional groups work a lot on policy. Again, they're not in public sector themselves, but working on public sector policy, like Policy Link, and certainly many of our regional members. So I think that's the short-term strategy. And ultimately, I mean, I think I can say we don't have a clear enough theory of change, right? So not surprising, it's very hard. It's a hard thing to do at this moment in history. So when I came in, what I said is, I don't think we can tackle that right now. I think we're going to collapse if we try and do that. So we took an approach to do what I in private called half-assed strategic planning or operational planning, saying we need like a 2 to 3 year plan, and we're not going to get to the most important core issues which is kind of breaks all my rules of planning, but it was what we needed right now. So we're getting there, and it's a key weakness.
Yeah, I actually have two questions. One was about theory of change, which I think you said something about, and particularly around time horizon. It's interesting to think about theory of change and what time horizon.
Yeah.
I have a much more practical question about the membership and your relationship to the membership. I think I got the idea that you believe in or find vital a democratic organization when it's driven by membership as opposed to a kind of like-minded, affluent individuals or something coming together and making a cause. That's what I got initially. The reason I asked the question is that as of late, we have a number of large environmental organizations in this country that are membership-based, and the question has come up whether the membership is undermining their mission in a substantial way, and it has a lot to do with the relationship to their membership, and you hinted at it by saying, ask little or less of them, and what a number of the environmental organizations seem to do is as they fight for survival by growing their membership, they lose their mission. I'm wondering if you have a similar structural question, or how your membership relates to you, and therefore how your mission will be edified by membership.
I think one of the things that we're experimenting with is what's the best size to do what we want to do. And of course, if you don't have a clear theory of change, it's very hard to say exactly what do you want the beast to look like if you don't know exactly what and how the beast is trying to accomplish things. So I think right now we haven't put particular emphasis on growing our coalition, and I think internally we feel like we actually function more as a network. Coalition, in our understanding of what is a coalition, tends to be much more narrowly focused on specific issues, more action. It's a more disciplined group of players going after a specific thing. We function more like a network, that we're more porous. We have this huge, sort of overwhelming mission, many sectors flowing through in different ways, and so it's more of a cat herding, and how do we align people that have common cause to be able to accomplish more together than they could separately. And through that process of kind of aligning this group, seeing where there's overlap, shaping, occasionally leading when needed, following when that seems appropriate, it's kind of a daunting task, right? To know when to play what role in that. So I think we don't want to build the membership too quickly and to have it too dispersed. So I think the current thinking for me is don't put everybody into the tent, but figure out the different types of bridges that can be built. And so we might even shrink as we get clear on what we're here to do in terms of number of members, if that seems the best way to have a clear values orientation that really brings people together. And then the job is to me it's concentric rings on a values basis. So we have people that we really share core values with. That might be a small number of folks, and then as the rings go out, the values get more dispersed as we essentially make more compromise or meeting of minds. And so I think it's a strategic question as much as anything, or even tactical. How far do we want our official boundaries to go, and then how do we learn to get better? And there's a lot of really interesting experimentation in networks and network theory. And so we're doing work with a couple different people, Movement Network Lab, Management Assistance Group. We've done a little with, here in Boston, Interaction Institute for Social Change. So we're really looking at different kind of models and practices that are happening right now around what are the trade-offs in building a network. So I think that's kind of the clearest answer I can give, is we're not trying to go too fast out. Different kinds of bridges, I think, is the answer. And I know the gentleman in the back is, if you saw him.
For a long time.
You already answered my first question which was about to what extent there was still a connection with NAD. I actually interned when it was back when it was back in like the New Economics Institute days.
Yeah.
And they had kind of space from the Rockefellers on Madison, like on Madison in New York.
Yeah.
Group that long ago already. My other question was, I think this was latent throughout the talk, but I don't know if it was ever explicitly like stated. Is you had to offer a definition of what new economy means from the perspective of the New Economy Coalition.
Yeah.
What would it be?
I read it.
We're committed to building a people and planet-friendly world. I mean, that's the short
Yeah.
answer.
I'm curious, I appreciate this very much, but I want to get back a bit to what Paul raised, and that had to do with the kind of uncomfortability, the notion of economics at the core of it. Because I think your goal, in fact, is not really that. It has much more to do with the kind of new systems project that's gotten underway. I wonder what's your relationship to that on one level. But more importantly, I think it points to the kind of thing that Bill McKibben has been able to achieve so beautifully as the effective poet of the environment. This is Wendell Berry was the poet for soil.
Yeah.
I mean, in some sense, the reason why McKibben is such an attractive figure is that he's articulated something that's way top down and way ground or grassroots up. In other words, it encapsulates both very quickly, and it has to do with a metaphorical change. And this is where I think your strong point could be. And it will take you totally out of the realm of the negotiative, this group, that group, the other. And that is, you have to shift the metaphor from the growth metaphor to the metaphor of sustainability. That's all. That will be your big success if you have it. And it won't be by building coalitions, networks, this, that, the other. It'll be by recognizing something that occurred to me when Paul mentioned it, this top-down, bottom-up stuff. It's like the beauty of, those Russian dolls you see around Christmas time that you can take apart and they get smaller and smaller. And then the essence of those things is not to take them apart and look at the smallest thing, or to put them back together and say that's it. But it's the relatedness of one set of things to another. And any 3-year-old can understand before language. Kids, given that, will play with it and see the wonder involved in it. And they'll take it all apart, and then they'll sort of try to put it all back together.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that that's the sensibility you want to move towards. In shifting the metaphor, as Bill McKibben has so effectively in reference to the global ecosystem. This is not just another cost. It's a total rethink.
Yeah. A lot of what you're saying resonates for me. I think, I mean, the name New Economy Coalition is not the right name for us. It's the name we have at the moment. I don't know how long it will last, but it does describe some piece of what we're about, but it's not really the right name. I would certainly agree with that. In terms of changing the story, I think we see that as a core part of our work, although we're in the very early stages of doing it. I think 350.org is a member of New Economy Coalition, and we love what they do. And my younger daughter is going to Middlebury College next year, starting. So a big fan of that, and I think part of the work we take on, which maybe slows us down, but to me, in terms of sustainability, it's the only way, is that we believe that narrative does not come from us, but does actually come from the grassroots. And that's a difficult undertaking. It's easier to develop a metaphor out of Bill McKibben and 7 of his students' brains than it is to do it in a grassroots fashion. And so we are playing, I think, with the cat dog again of how much can we steer and lead and how much do we learn, follow, and lift up. And I think particularly in terms of really unlearning what I call, perhaps in a confrontative way, white supremacy And again, getting back to our history, I think it's essential for us to sometimes slow down, but to really unpack how does the new narrative happen. So I don't think it's our right as New Economy Coalition, as a staff of 12 and with 18 board members or what have you, I don't think it's our place or our right, and I don't think it's the long-term efficacious way to go for us to develop the new narrative. So I think our commitment is to build those narratives and narrative from the bottom up, but us providing some top-down leadership. So
well, I have a little...
that might be slightly evasive, but...
well, it's too anthropocentric. In other words, the question is not whether you build the narrative, you recognize it from the bottom up or top down, but whether you recognize that you're part of a bigger narrative. That's already underway. That's been in every language in human existence since the beginning. Right?
I would say that that's... But it's not black and white in my experience. It's a lived into experience that we have to keep remaking that choice and keep learning how to do that in new ways. So I agree with you, and I think it's a lived into thing. I have given various talks in the last few years on what I call the 5,000-year history of fair trade. And saying fair trade is nothing new. I didn't invent it, founding Equal Exchange or anybody else. We're just part of this tradition. The narrative has been there. People have known how to put Mother Earth in the center of our existence. People have struggled as long as there's recorded history of human beings for what is social justice and how to create a just society. I don't think we're doing anything new. We're trying to build on what people have done and maybe get back to some original ideas that perhaps were never lived, but at least were imagined.
So we have 3 people waiting. 1, 2, 3. Any of you want to follow up on this thread of the conversation, or will it be a new thread?
Related.
Yeah. Okay. So Jenny, go ahead.
So I just wanted to get your sense of, given kind of growing dissatisfaction with the status quo, right, that we see in the presidential elections right now. I guess I was kind of surprised that you kind of said that the strategy in terms of public sector is not very tight, right, or not very well defined.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious, like, what kinds of new opportunities, or what kind of trajectory do you see with this, evolving time that is so clearly demonstrating this dissatisfaction and growing inequality and if you could give us a little bit of sense of the new opportunities or growth, trajectory of how things are changing for the coalition.
I would say we're in a moment of building conversation around that, and certainly the rise of Bernie Sanders' campaign and the incredible energy that's erupted with that and the hunger that's erupted with that. I think we are talking to many of our members about how do we support them to tap into that energy, and that's always the dance for us. How much do we do by leading by specific action ourselves? Like, we don't organize around issues ourselves, but we're helping shape this network to try and help steer and respond to what our members want. So I think it is a tremendous opportunity, and we're not that far along in figuring out what role is there for New Economy Coalition and our network to really plug into that. So mostly it's been in conversations with People's Action, 350.org, even the student divestment, reinvestment movement. How do we support you to better tap into this moment? In terms of the public sector or policy piece, I don't have a very good answer on that. And I'll say, I wish I had our membership person, Mike Sandmel, was here. He would have a much more articulate answer. But for me, a year in, I feel like I'm just figuring that part out is still murky to me.
There's a lot of indications out there. Near future is going to be quite different than the recent past.
Yeah.
And the near future is likely to be energy short, climate compromised, and how do you deal with being both people and planet friendly when so many of dispossessed people have been brought up to some kind of mode of increasing standard of living by throwing cheap energy at it. So as the cheap energy goes away and the environmental costs of using it, how do you bring people into a better life?
Well, I think for us in New Economy Coalition, I mean, that's a deep question, right, that has many layers globally. And yeah, I love hard, deep questions. I think for us, in a practical sense, one of the key areas where there's a lot of energy and passion right now is around energy democracy, is I think the loose term. And so for us, right now, our role is helping some leaders in the energy democracy work figure out a bolder strategy and how do we support them, whether that's even giving them access to more leadership training or doing certain convenings. That's what we see as our role in the short term, is helping them really create the vision. So we don't see it possible right now for us to be like the visionaries in each of these areas. We work in so many areas. So we have that kind of dance of sometimes we feel like there's a need or an opportunity for us to provide some leadership, but we're almost never the thought leaders ourselves, or I'd say never the thought leaders ourselves. So it's a question of how do we help support and bring together? So Energy Democracy will have one of these network gatherings before our Common Bound Conference and bring together a broader group of folks than has met before around energy democracy to try and figure out what's the intersection between people doing community-based renewables and companies like Solar City and Sungevity and the policy pieces and the policy setbacks that are in Nevada or elsewhere, and the policy opportunities in other places. So I think that's what we're trying to do, is mostly we shape, convene, lift up, but we're not leading ourselves. There's enough other people that are the experts in any particular field. Did that kind of got there?
Nicely with my question. Basically, what I hear you say is that you are potentially a movement of grassroots, bottom-up processes. And in the beginning of your talk, you said that the role of money needs to be criticized or completely rethought. But what I'm looking for, not maybe from you personally, but from one of the experts that you are working with, is what could a new economics, not new economy, but new economics look like? Economics as a science,
yeah,
right? That is, we all know that it is deeply flawed, and that it is everywhere taught. And there are, of course, all kinds of fringe economic movements that try to become a little bit more ecological or behavioral or what you name it. So my question basically is, with which people are you collaborating that could articulate new economics in a more effective way than just saying it is good for the planet and for the people? Because that's not enough for me.
Yeah, no, they asked for succinct, how do you say it succinctly? I would say for us, the people we work most closely with are Next Systems Project, which has some economics in it, but is also more of the kind of vision, some of it's really big picture of sort of how the pieces fit together, what does the economy look like in practical terms. And so again, I think we have a ways to go on this, but the opportunities there, New Economics Foundation, Demos, TELUS, I mean, we have right in our membership the seeds for that. So far, we haven't done a heck of a lot. With that, I think the Common Bound Conference, some of that will be in the workshops on the stage, and we'll also bring in some international people and have this little research lab which will be a time for people some researchers and some practitioners, to be able to share experiences, build relationship, and just for the first time, or to deepen understanding of what's happening in other parts of the world around building new economic theory, as well as the practice of how do you put it into place. So yeah, I mean, it's the humble answer to some of these questions is, well, we're just beginning. Oh, we're just, like, that's on the idea stage.
So we'll take 2 quick questions. People who've been waiting patiently, and then we need to wrap up the formal part of it. Yes.
What I was thinking in part about was the very purpose of your coalition. You mentioned repeatedly about providing leadership. And I've actually had the chance to see a grassroots movement in Cambridge by a South Asian community there that intends to address problems of climate change, deforestation, the lack of democracy, and so on. Mm-hmm. And although they're looking primarily at a South Asian perspective, they're also considering it in a global perspective. And the thing is, this community, the way I look at it, and the way you spoke about leadership, it struck me that this community is really doing things in a very egalitarian, democratic sort of way, that they don't really require leadership. And even if their interests are regional, it's because they're dealing with problems that are not spoken about in that region. So the way I was thinking about it was, perhaps when you're speaking of providing leadership to communities, perhaps that is taking a rather narrow approach to the whole thing, because to me it occurs to me that there's a whole lot of community work going on, a lot of grassroots movements that simply are not bridged together. They are perfectly capable of taking care of themselves, but the real facilitation would be to bridge between them so that they can work together, that we're all facing different facets of the same problem and are operating on parallel tracks. So rather than coming together in one umbrella and being led from one group, the real thing would be for all of these groups to coordinate on their own respective tracks towards their own facets of the problem.
I think if I said that our role was to provide the leadership for grassroots groups, that wasn't my intention. So I believe in general, what we're trying to do is lift up grassroots leadership. And we do that by occasionally providing some resources for their skill development or relationship building or access to money or power or people. And a lot of that is through just providing access to relationship building. And so then we're doing some shaping around, say, a working group or a collaboration. But we feel pretty strongly, I would say, that the leadership, particularly at a grassroots level, it comes from the grassroots. We're not looking to provide leadership for grassroots movements in any ways. We're looking to lift up that leadership. At times, our leadership is in bringing people together. We, as much as possible, again, lift up so that grassroots leaders are figuring out how to collaborate, how to work together, how to build those bridges. At times, we provide some leadership to make that happen. But mostly, we're trying to figure out how do we lift up others.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
I have a fairly quick, not too big picture question, but I've been involved representing TELUS on the New Economy Coalition calls and calls, and now the Croton Institute, and I've been to the conferences and the annual meeting last year, and I think you're doing great work, and I appreciate everything you're working through, having been there and seeing the diversity of what's going on.
Yeah.
Just a question, I mean, before the leadership transition, there were some services being offered, like monthly calls where we would be introduced to a different member and see the work on the ground. And I found that fascinating, just to learn how it's been done, and not just reading out of the paper, but seeing and talking and having some interaction. I know that went on pause for some time. There's also communications training, was learning about that, and it sounds like you're working towards some of that. I'm just wondering what's the next steps, and how can other people be involved? I know right now it's more or less like one person, one or two people per institute or organization are involved. Is there any plan to expand the reach of that? And just what's in the works?
Yeah, the working groups will be the primary way going forward, that there will be more opportunity for people to be more connected and more involved. So we will have a meta-narrative working group around this whole narrative project, and there will be opportunity for members to be part at a couple different levels of what that narrative project is, how it works, how the narratives are developed. Other working groups will be dependent. Hopefully they're going to grow out of this Common Bound conference. There already are these workshop tracks, so in a way that could be the basis for some working groups to be formed. It's unclear, so it's kind of up to what comes out of it. Again, we're providing this container with the workshop tracks and workshops, network gatherings, with some fuzzy hope that that will lead to some opportunities that emerge for working groups. If not, we will, through polling members, etc., create some working groups where there's energy and leadership there, so there'll be more opportunities. Again, there will be, the communications group will be resurrected for sure, and there'll be some number, probably up to 5, coming out of Common Bound, I think is what we can support. We just are adding another membership support person also to be able to really make that happen. So stay tuned. It will become clear, I would say, in the next few months, the next 6 months.
Thank you, Jonathan, on behalf of everybody. Thank you, everybody. We'll have a few minutes of informal mingling,
Yeah.
so there is no...
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.